It's good to be with you all. So I invite you to notice and maybe hold on to whatever curiosity or resistance you might have felt in that reading from our forebear, Quillen Hamilton Shinn. And know for the moment at least that Quillen Hamilton Shinn practiced what he preached. During his career as a circuit rider, Shinn is said to have traveled more than 38,000 miles, many of those by foot or horseback, traveling every state of the Union and beyond, preaching the good news of Universalism. He was seemingly inexhaustible, sometimes preaching as much as once a day. So during his 37 years on the circuit, Shinn founded over 40 Universalist churches, recruiting more than 1,000 new members. Shinn's vigor may have been unparalleled, but he was far from unique at that time. Part of a longer lineage of Universalist evangelists, he followed in the footsteps of the earliest traveling Universalist preachers in the United States. In addition to well-known Universalists like John Murray or Hosea Ballou, there was a cadre of scarcely remembered young men and some women, often from rural areas and little education, who continued to travel and preach the Universalist gospel. While Shinn and many Universalist preachers avoided the sensational style common among circuit riders from other denominations, many were renowned orators and impressive improvisers, allowing them to skillfully work a crowd with little or no relationship or frills in their setup. Shinn famously led an Easter Sunday service in a blacksmith shop, creatively creating an altar by covering the lathe with a newspaper. But more powerful and more important than their style was their message. There is no hell for any of us to fear outside of ourselves, Shinn would proclaim. I think even on the surface, it's easy to see the allure of such a sentiment. Tom Owen Toll writes that because they were blessed with such an uplifting message, Universalists could hardly help but be evangelists. Especially compared to the dominant theologies of the time, the Universalists had good news to preach. Shinn's contemporary, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, offers an insight into the gloomy Calvinist doctrine of the time, with its emphasis on the total depravity of human nature and the everlasting punishment that seemed almost inevitable. Amidst graphic descriptions of long processions of sinners being swept away into the burning depths of liquid fire, this God at the time was the judge, unforgivable, unforgiving, and unapproachable. Universalists waged a powerful critique against this idea, sharing instead of a God whose fundamental nature is love. And they critiqued the social implications of that dominant theology too, arguing that worshiping a judging God who loved some and hated others furthered and normalized hate and judgment in the human community. While there was great theological diversity among these early Universalist thinkers, the powerful idea that transcended those differences and brought unity to the movement was this conviction of God's love for all human beings. A love so powerful that because of it, all would be saved. This emphasis on God's love came to be distilled to the phrase, God is love. And though the words themselves were not controversial even at the time, they come directly from Christian scripture, that phrase came to be a concise and powerful statement of what was a heretical Universalist theology. For naming that God is love connotes a universal love for all humanity, one that doesn't distinguish between believers and unbelievers, between good and bad, rich and poor, any of these categories, one that includes and embraces all people, no matter how flawed, how broken they might appear. No mistake, no failing, And above all, no person could be beyond redemption. It's no surprise then that the theology of our Universalist forebears undergirded their prophetic witness against slavery, capital punishment, and a punitive penal system, not to mention their support for women's suffrage and equitable education. Belief in a universal God seemed to encourage higher levels of respect and concern for one another. For unlike that prevailing belief in heaven and hell, which asserts that justice will be served in the afterlife, Universalists argued that both heaven and hell could be created here and now. And it was beholden upon each person to strive not only for her own salvation, but the salvation of the whole, the salvation of the world here and now. Now, I grew up Unitarian Universalist, and I never heard of Quillen Hamilton Shinn or Hosea Ballou or John Murray. And in fact, as a young Unitarian Universalist, my aversion to evangelism might have led me to dismiss that history altogether. Besides, it seemed to me then that we didn't need to be evangelists. I'd share as a young person, even in passing, some of the basic principles of Unitarian Universalism, and I had a veritable parade of friends joining me in worship on Sunday morning. Some of them were alienated from their familial traditions. Others were unchurched and looking for some kind of spiritual grounding, spiritual more. But regardless of what brought them through our doors, I remember one thing in common. Welcome. Every Sunday morning, our worship leader would begin. Welcome. Whoever you are, wherever you come from, whoever you love, whatever you believe, you are welcome here. And with those words, I remember feeling my friend's shoulders relax. We didn't need to be traveling the country preaching our good news. The radical welcome of Unitarian Universalism spoke for itself, and people were hungry for it. And yet, through those same years, I watched as over half of my peers stopped attending our UU church. I hung on for a while, teaching Sunday school and sneaking into the back of the sanctuary in time for the sermon. But when life got busy, when I moved away from my home congregation, I started to drift away too. I was delighted that I found other communities that welcomed me in as a queer person, that valued diverse beliefs, that were committed to social justice. And for a while, I mistook those as an adequate substitute. Without clarity of the core of our tradition, I went off looking for secondary characteristics. Growing up Unitarian Universalist, I missed our good news. Even as I saw it, even as I watched others receive it, I missed our good news. And I don't think I was the only one. As the theological diversity of our denomination has increased, our Universalist heritage has come to be reflected more in our theological anthropology than our theology. That is, it's more of a statement about the nature of people than in the nature of God. This message, I think, is most clearly distilled into our first principle. We Unitarian Universalists covenant to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. And like our Universalist ancestors, this principle grounds and supports our prophetic witness, our struggles for racial, gender, and economic justice, and more. It is a powerful statement in and of itself. One, I think, with the power, if fully realized, to dramatically alter the fabric of our society. And I think its expression, the powerful welcome of our congregations, is what helped my friends relax into the chairs Sunday morning. And yet contemporary Unitarian Universalists are not traveling the country preaching our good news. This first principle is not proclaimed across the side of barns. It's not even on the banners of a lot of our congregations. Our reluctance to evangelize may be part of the reason, but I think it begs the question, does our contemporary articulation of this radical idea have the same power as the universalist theological contention that shaped it? Contemporary UU theologian Rebecca Ann Parker writes that our first principle calls us each to self-respect and to respect of one another. But I have to say, next to the early universalist and actually also Unitarian idea that not only do all people have innate worth, but that all people are inheritors of a godlike nature, the respect encouraged by the first principle feels to me comparatively uninspiring. No doubt, the shift in our theological stance on the nature of humanity comes in part from an important collective reckoning with the violence, war, and alienation of the 20th century. The revelation, too, for those of us in the dominant culture, at least, of the horrors of white supremacy, of our collective capacity for evil. But how does this sit with the idea that 20th century universalist Clarence Skinner asserts that all social inequity emerges from a theological inadequacy? All social inequity emerges from a theological inadequacy. Is our theological shrinking a response to the violence we see, or is it a validation of it? Ballou contends that nothing but love can do away with sin. Nothing but love. Maybe sin doesn't resonate with your spiritual lexicon. It doesn't really with mine. So try substituting something that does. Nothing but love can do away with oppression. Nothing but love can do away with violence. Nothing but love can do away with hate. In an interview with Krista Tippett in 2016, civil rights icon and public theologian Ruby Sales calls for a new public theology for the 21st century. What we need, Sales professed, are theologies that redefine what it means to be fully human, that speak to the spiritual crisis in this country. Remember, this interview was in 2016. Ultimately, she argues what we need are theologies that raise people up from disposability to essentiality. Adrienne Marie Brown, an author, social justice facilitator, and healer, expands on the same idea, on this culture of disposability. She contends that we have created a culture where some people are disposable, in which we can fail at being human, can be killed as punishment, can be collateral damage, can be wasted or tortured or locked in a small box for the rest of their lives, given no hope of transformation or a future in society. And this culture, Brown notes, shows up also in communities who resist this kind of punitive method. It shows up in call-outs, in cancel culture, and our obsession with critique, our insistence on perfection. Perhaps the theological intervention of universalism is as essential today as it was 200 years ago, because it is a theology that raises people up from the illusion of disposability to the abiding truth that all of us are essential. It is a theology with the power to counter the systems that dehumanize and oppress, to unsettle our collective reliance on callouts and critique. It is a theology that can remake the world, in which our fundamental worth and interdependence is more fully realized and more deeply felt. So how can we reclaim that power? In a denomination now home to theists, agnostics, humanists, and atheists alike, it is clear that God is love cannot be our authentic rallying cry. But there is some undeniable potency in that simplicity, right? Charles Howe riffs on Mahatma Gandhi's evolution from God is truth to truth is God, offering that in transforming our universalist heritage into something that's contemporarily relatable, love is God makes religious sense too. If the essence of faith is what Paul Tillich describes as ultimate concern, it isn't a far jump, I don't think, to say that the ultimate concern most strongly felt in Unitarian Universalism is love. This congregation and many other Unitarian Universalist congregations across the country begin their covenants with this powerful and simple affirmation. Love is the spirit of this church. We side with love in our public prophetic witness. And I checked a hunch confirming that love is one of the most commonly appearing words in our hymnals. We answer the call to love. Love will guide us. We say yes to love. Whether we name it explicitly or not, the call of love guides our tradition. Last year, the Unitarian Universalist Association Board, in keeping with the bylaws of that association of congregations, charged a group called the Article 2 Study Commission with a deep study and reflection on the question of what holds us together as a denomination. In doing so, they reflected on love as our common theological core. Love, they attest, lies behind all of our principles. It peeks out through the words of each of the 7. Love is our deepest commitment to one another. And that reflection cite Robert Miller's study of Unitarian Universalism, which found that UUs rank love as a value more highly than any other respondent, religious and not. Maybe just like our Universalist ancestors, this is the point of commonality that unites us across our differences. What would be the impact of more clearly asserting that belief? That the force in the universe that we choose to align ourselves with is love. Love that knows no bounds. Love that embraces every single one of us. Love that treats all life, all people, as essential. What would happen if we claimed that theology with the vigor of the Universalist circuit riders, even if just within our own walls? Because beyond the missionary spirit that our circuit riding forebears promote, I think we need it for those of us who are already here. A reminder of that good news, that life-saving news of our tradition. And perhaps more importantly, a reminder of our commitment and responsibility to each other and to our world. So may this larger love guide us. May it call us forward. May that love show us what we owe to each other and to our world. And may we share that good news. May it be so.